Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me well in the back? All good? Okay. Yeah, very happy always to be in a BIFoR annual meeting. And I'm gonna start with this photo, which is not a zoom-in photo of a broccoli. It is actually a photo of a forest community. And this photo in particularly is the photo from a drone of Barro Colorado Island, which is an island in the Panama Canal. And it happens to be the most studied tropical forest in the world. And I want to explain what I mean by community by going through this photo, which I spend a lot of time staring at. So if you see this big tree in the middle, it's a canopy tree, it's an emergent tree, likely one of the largest trees in this forest. And large trees in the tropics, they are super important for the carbon storage capacity. So the 1% largest trees in the tropics, they store around 50% of the carbon of the systems. And this is one strategy in this forest. And I want to keep in mind this idea of strategy and trees having different strategies. So if you look at this star there, which is actually a palm tree, and you can see different palm trees inside this picture if you start noticing. Palm trees sometimes are not even considered trees themselves, but they are super important. They are extremely abundant in tropical forests, and they have an important role for the fauna. They have very fatty fruits, which are important for mammals and birds. And because they are super abundant, they're also being used by humans as well, and they have a very important cultural connections with the forest. Then you see this different color there, it's a blurb, but this could be a subcanopy tree, and I highlighted this because it has this different color, meaning that probably it's flowering, and this shows the diversity in terms of also timing for things to happen in the forest. So while some trees are flowering now, and when this picture is taken, other trees are not, and this diversity also talks about when you invest your resources, whether it's in a drought period or in a wet period. And these are all different strategies. And when we're talking about forest communities, we're talking about this diversity of strategies and trying to understand how this diversity of strategies are responding to climate change and will shape the forest in the future. So the big question is actually then understanding this diversity of strategies under global change. And in this brief talk, I'm going to go through 3 points. First, I want to highlight the value of each species. So you might argue, well, why do we need to care about all the species? They might be doing things very similar. Let's talk a little bit about that. I'm going to go a little bit focusing on giant trees because they are so important for the carbon. But also, I'm going to show a little bit of diversity on that. And I'm going to talk about signs of adaptation, thinking that changes in community are actually a way, it's actually a way of which forests are adapting to climate change. So first, in this part of the value of each species, I want to focus on the rare species. Rare species are extremely abundant in tropical forests. Actually, in the Amazon, 1/3 of all the species are considered very rare. But we often question, we often ignore them in ecology, actually, because we don't have enough information about them. But also, we question the value of these rare species. So just very briefly, this is what happens if you lose a rare species versus a common species. So this study here, they actually repeated the analysis for fish, trees, and birds, but they started removing species from the community and then calculating an index called functional diversity, which kind of gives an idea of the diversity of functions as I explained these different functions I explained to you in the forest. So when you start removing, this is actually Leighton et al. The citation is not here, but very good paper. But when you start removing the rare and the common species, you see this first decay of of functional diversity as you remove the rare species. And it's actually quite a sharp decay in the forest. And this is a forest from French Guiana, which is an extremely diverse but also quite wet forest in the north of the Amazon region. So you see this decay of functional diversity more rapid than the decay that happens for the common species. So if you take a rare species, you lose more function than if you take a common species. And that gives you an idea that actually these rare species are super important for the diversity for the functionality of these forests. So we were thinking of how this varies across space. This is one place. This is, of course, repeated similar patterns for birds and trees and fish, but is one forest only. So Estelle Darko, who is here today and can tell you a little bit more about, she's there in the back, tell you a little bit more about her work. She has been repeating this analysis, but now for the Baú Colorado Island forest, which actually is a much drier forest. And what we've found so far, these are preliminary analysis, is that the very rare species, they actually somehow are quite redundant. And once you start taking them out, you don't lose as much functional diversity as when you take out the abundant species. So that gives an idea that maybe this pattern might vary when you go from a dry to a wet site. And the next step of Estelle's PhD now is looking at this variation across different forests and see what we find and whether there is more redundancy in drier areas than in wetter areas. So now that was a quick talk about rare species, but let's move to the big ones because, of course, there is a lot of importance in the carbon storing capacity of these forests. And the big trees are, as I mentioned before, are extremely important for carbon storage on tropical forests. Actually, if we start then again thinking about the loss of these big trees, if you lose, this is just an analysis showing what happened when you increase the mortality rate of different size classes. So if you increase the mortality rate of very small trees, 1 to 10 centimeters in diameter at breast height, you don't see much change in the carbon loss. So the carbon loss is almost the same for the whole community. But then if you start increasing the mortality of the trees between 10 and 50 centimeters, you start having a response in the biomass carbon loss. And if you start losing these very big trees, which are quite rare in the landscape, the ones above 50 centimeters, which are very often ignored when we do any analysis about mortality because they are basically quite rare, so we don't have enough data for them. Then you start having a much bigger increase in terms of carbon loss per mortality rate increase. But what we've been seeing is that, at least in the literature so far, we find that the mortality drivers of these different trees, if we compare the big ones with, so the mortality drivers might change across size. So this is basically the tree size, and then this is the relative contribution of different drivers. And here we have the biotic drivers in blue and the abiotic drivers in red. And what we see is that there is a greater contribution of abiotic drivers to mortality of the very large trees. These very large trees are quite exposed in the canopy, so they might be more likely to die from wind and lightning. And they are taller, so they have much more tension in the water column that might make them more likely to die from water stress. And they are also more exposed in the canopy. So in this sense, climate change might affect more these very large trees in comparison to the average size tree. But I want to highlight here that we have very limited support for what happens in the very big trees. And we have now a NERC and SF project called Gigante, where we are actually trying to understand what happens, what are the drivers of mortality of these very large trees. So yeah, abiotic factors, very important for the mortality of large trees. But thinking about the community, every large tree is different from each other, and it actually can be very different in terms of their mortality rates and function. So we wanted to actually understand what happens in that part of the community, the very large trees. Vanessa Rubio, who is a postdoc in this project, and the NERC-NSF project, she has been looking at the mortality rates of these trees. So this is just the trees above 50 centimeters and different species of those trees. And we find a very large variation from 0.4 to 7% mortality per year once the tree reached the canopy. Meaning that the lifespan in the canopy from these trees, from these large trees, can vary from 13 to 267 years. And that has a big implication if you think about the carbon fluxes from this tree. So here we just basically use this mortality rate and try to estimate what would happen in terms of carbon loss or gain if the rate of mortality was the average mortality for the community for these giant trees. And you see that some species like Diptera or Aerifera would have a massive contribution to carbon flux if their mortality rate increases. And often these big trees are treated as one thing. And this work has shown that actually there is a massive diversity within this part of the community as well that should be considered when we try to model forests in the future. But let's think of the forest in the future now. I'm going to briefly mention a few evidence of communities changing, and when one species replaces the other in a community, it's likely that that's a way of adapting for the forest to adapt. So we look at changes in the community for the recruits, like Bruno showed yesterday for the forest in the UK. And what we find is that the trees that are coming in the community every year, they tend to be more affiliated to dry conditions. So we see these recruits becoming more dry affiliated and the forest adapting somehow to the drier conditions of Amazonian forests. But then we try to ask the similar question for other systems. So this is a work by Julen Astigarraga, who was a PhD in the University of Alcalá in Spain, but spent some time in Birmingham working with us. And he used part of a database that we put together. And he looked at more than 2 million trees and tried to understand how the different species are responding to, how different species are changing in terms of their populations. And what he found is that here, so basically what he did is looking at different species and then changes in population size. So basically changes in the basal area they have in the number of stems under cold and wet climates and warm and arid climates, and try to compare what happened in cold and wet and versus warm and arid. And what he found is that 47% of the species have increasing populations in these cold and wet climates, meaning there is somehow a migration of species towards these regions. But he didn't find any characteristic of the species, for instance, the drought tolerance or any other functional characteristic that actually it's allowing those species to migrate. And that was a bit tricky for us to interpret, and we believe that maybe there is somehow these populations might have some degree or a greater degree of intraspecific variability, with maybe some individuals being able to migrate and others not. So what are the next steps? And I'm nearly finishing. So I think for this audience, one thing I wanted to highlight is that we are also looking at different species and how they're responding to CO2 at Amazon face. And we are now looking at the baseline data for that. And the interesting thing here is that This is an extremely diverse system with over 200 species in this location. So it's a very big challenge, but also allow us to answer these questions of how different species are responding to change, and then try to figure out how to model that for the future as well. And for me, a natural next step is to try to think of a system, a synthesis across global forests. So we're trying to do that with Tom Pugh and Oliver Phillips, trying to understand how these different forests are responding and how communities are changing in different locations. So that's all. Thank you for listening. And I want to acknowledge all the collaborators who actually make this work happen. And some of the names are there, but there are many more as well. Thank you.